Money, a simple tool for exchange or the most powerful force in modern history? Since the dawn of civilization, money has been a symbol of power. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a select group of men turned this tool into something far greater. They didn't just accumulate fortunes, they reshaped the global economy, influenced government policies, and became key players in wars, crises, and revolutions. These men didn't need political office to rule. They controlled money, and whoever controls money controls everything. Have you ever heard of the Lehmans, the Goldmans, the Schiffs, the Warburgs? These last names don't appear in political campaigns or on protest banners, but their decisions shape the fate of the world. They financed industrial empires, saved nations from bankruptcy, and at the same time, were accused of manipulating markets and concentrating wealth in the shadows. At first, these men were nothing more than German Jewish immigrants fleeing persecution in Europe, peddlers who roamed the United States selling goods door to door. But within a few years, they built banks, took control of Wall Street, and started dictating the course of American capitalism. And with that came secret alliances, political dealings, and conspiracies that made them both revered and feared. In today's episode, we dive into the history of the money kings, the true architects of the modern financial system. They didn't just build financial empires, they helped finance World War I, turned Wall Street into the powerhouse it is today, and even influenced US immigration laws. If you think the world's biggest decisions are made by politicians, this video might make you rethink everything you know. Welcome to Scheffer Vision. Every great financial dynasty starts somewhere, but the men who founded the Wall Street empires weren't born rich, didn't inherit fortunes, and had no privileges ensuring their success. In fact, their stories begin in the most unlikely way possible, as refugees fleeing poverty and persecution in Europe. In the 19th century, Germany and Eastern Europe were hostile environments for Jews. Economic restrictions, violent pogroms, and laws that forbade them from owning land or working in many professions pushed them toward the only option available: peddling. Selling fabrics, household items, and small luxury goods, these men traveled from town to town, carrying their merchandise on their backs, sleeping wherever they could, and struggling to survive. For many, the only hope lay across the Atlantic. This was the beginning of the journey for families like the Lehmans, the Goldmans, the Sachses, the Warburgs, and the Schiffs. They boarded fragile ships, fleeing oppression, and arrived in the United States with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few coins sewn into their pockets. They had nothing except a sharp business instinct and a desperate need to succeed. But in the United States, a rapidly expanding country, there was one key factor that changed everything. Money was flowing, and those who knew how to move it could rise quickly. In the New World, these immigrants continued doing what they knew best, selling goods door to door. Over time, they opened small stores, selling fabrics, clothing, and valuable items. They understood something fundamental about commerce. Where there were people, there were needs. Where there were needs, there were opportunities. But the real breakthrough came when they realized they could make more money by financing their own customers. Instead of just selling goods, they started offering credit to other merchants and small business owners. They became intermediaries, financiers, and little by little, bankers. As their trade networks grew, some of these families took an even bigger step. In New York, financial firms began to emerge, companies that would later become giants: Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, and Kuhn, Loeb & Co. These men understood before anyone else that true power wasn't just in selling goods, but in controlling the flow of money. By offering credit to merchants, they began financing not just small businesses, but entire industries, railroads, and even governments. What started as a group of immigrants selling products from backpacks on American streets would transform into the most powerful institutions in the global economy. They stopped just moving goods and started moving the destiny of nations. This was the birth of a financial elite that, in just a few years, wouldn't just become wealthy, but would set the rules of the money game in the modern world. It all started with small shops. Then came loans to merchants. But soon, these bankers realized something much bigger. True power wasn't in selling goods, but in controlling the money that fueled the economy. These immigrants, who had arrived with nothing, quickly understood that America's growth depended on infrastructure, credit, and large-scale investments. Those who had the capital to finance this expansion wouldn't just become wealthy, they would dictate the pace of the American economy. This is how financial empires emerged, turning Wall Street into the epicenter of global capitalism. At first, the game was simple: finance local merchants. Banking firms provided credit to small business owners, allowing them to purchase inventory and expand. That was already profitable, but these bankers weren't satisfied with small loans. They wanted to finance the entire economy. That's when they saw a massive opportunity: railroads. By the late 19th century, the United States was growing at a frantic pace. Cities were rising, new factories were being built, and the only way to connect the country was through a vast railroad network. But there was a problem. This kind of expansion required capital, a lot of capital, and that's where the bankers stepped in. Jacob Schiff, one of the most influential financiers of the time, recognized the potential of railroads before almost anyone else. He didn't just fund the construction of major railway lines, he used his financial power to weaken his rivals. One of his boldest moves was challenging J.P. Morgan and the groups that dominated the railroad industry by directly financing their competitors, effectively breaking down established monopolies. The Lehman brothers also played a crucial role in this financial game. Lehman Brothers started as a small business in the southern United States, but quickly realized that the real money was in financing large-scale operations. Their bank not only helped fund railroads, but also invested directly in the country's infrastructure expansion, ensuring that their financial networks were deeply intertwined with America's growth. This was the turning point. These bankers were no longer just intermediaries. They had become the true masters of the game. They didn't just lend money to major projects, they decided which projects would be built, which companies would grow, and which would be left behind. Money was no longer just a medium of exchange. It had become an instrument of control, and with every new railway they financed, every corporate merger they approved, and every major Wall Street transaction they completed, these men solidified their dominance over the economy. In less than half a century, immigrants who arrived in America with nothing became the architects of the most powerful financial system in the world. They weren't just building railroads and funding industries. They were creating the model of capitalism that still rules the planet today. In the world of finance, money is not just a tool, it's a weapon. And in the late 19th century, this weapon was in the hands of two powerful groups locked in a silent but brutal battle for control of the American economy. On one side were the German Jewish bankers, immigrants who had turned small businesses into financial empires. On the other were the Christian magnates, names like J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and Andrew Carnegie, men who already dominated the game and had no intention of sharing power with anyone. To the old guard titans, these Jewish bankers were intruders, outsiders, trying to take over Wall Street, a place that had long been controlled by European aristocratic descendants and Protestant elites, who commanded the country's largest fortunes. While J.P. Morgan and his allies built monopolies and consolidated control over the most profitable industries of the time, railroads, oil, and steel, the Jewish bankers played a different game. They had no vast inheritances or influential family ties within the government. They had only one weapon: financial intelligence. Jacob Schiff, one of the most powerful Jewish bankers of the era, became the greatest threat to J.P. Morgan's dominance. He understood that real power lay in controlling credit, not just in industries, but in the government itself. While Morgan tried to centralize the country's financial system in his own hands, Schiff and his firm Kuhn, Loeb & Co. challenged his influence by financing his competitors. The most striking example was when Schiff helped break Edward Harriman's railroad monopoly, a key ally of Morgan, by funding Harriman's direct rivals. This move not only proved that Jewish bankers could compete at the highest level, but also showed they were willing to go head-to-head with the established titans. Meanwhile, John D. Rockefeller, who controlled oil through his company, Standard Oil, viewed the growing influence of Jewish banks with suspicion. He understood that whoever controlled credit would eventually control his empire. This became a financial Cold War. While the Christian magnates tried to maintain their absolute dominance, Jewish bankers were slowly infiltrating the financial structure of the United States. The turning point in this war came during the financial crisis of 1907. As the market collapsed, Wall Street fell into panic. It was J.P. Morgan who stepped in to save the financial system, gathering the country's top bankers to stabilize the market and prevent a total economic meltdown. But this event revealed something crucial. Power was already shifting away from industrialists and toward the bankers. From that moment on, the real masters of money were not the industrial tycoons, but those who knew how to manipulate financial flows. This rivalry shaped the modern economic system. The battle between Jewish bankers and Christian magnates laid the foundation for the Federal Reserve, the U.S. central bank, creating a new model of financial control that still exists today. In the end, the industrial magnates built empires based on physical resources, oil, steel, and railroads. But the bankers understood something even more profound. Money doesn't need to be tied to anything physical. It can be a system in itself, and whoever controls that system controls everything. Since the early rise of Wall Street, bankers had already understood that the real game wasn't just about financing businesses or controlling markets. The real game was about financing nations, deciding who would have the resources to grow and who would fall behind, and beyond that, influencing the wars that would shape the modern world. One of the earliest examples of this silent game of power was the American Civil War. In the mid-19th century, the United States was divided between North and South. The North sought to abolish slavery and push industrial modernization, while the South depended on slavery to sustain its agrarian economy. But wars are expensive, and neither side could fight without money. That's when the bankers stepped in. Real power is rarely where people think it is. While politicians give speeches, generals command armies, and nations engage in ideological and territorial battles, there are forces operating behind the scenes that are rarely mentioned. These are the men who don't carry rifles but pens, who don't invade territories but buy entire economies, who don't run for office but finance those who will govern. These men controlled the flow of money, and with that, they held more power than any army ever could. August Belmont, a German Jewish financier who had already become one of the most influential figures of the time, used his international network to raise funds for the Union, ensuring that the North had the resources to keep its army running. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, European bankers were evaluating whether it was worth financing the Confederacy, weighing which side of the war was a safer investment. Money became just as crucial as the battles on the field, and those who controlled its flow had more influence over the war's outcome than the generals themselves. J.P. Morgan, one of the most powerful bankers of the time, didn't wait for political decisions. He began financing the Allies, securing billions in loans for Britain and France before the U.S. officially entered the war. This move was critical. When a bank like Morgan's pours billions into one side of a conflict, it's not just a financial bet, it's an investment that must be protected. Thus, the U.S. had a direct economic incentive to join the war on the side of the Allies, ensuring that Wall Street's loans were repaid and that the American economy would emerge stronger from the conflict. Decades later, this dynamic would repeat itself, but on an even larger scale. When World War I broke out, the United States had not yet decided which side to join, but Wall Street had already made its choice. During the Panic of 1907, a banking crisis threatened to collapse the U.S. financial system. The government was powerless, and with no central bank to intervene, the responsibility fell into the hands of Morgan. He gathered the country's top bankers in a closed-door meeting and, without public knowledge, decided the fate of the American financial system. Meanwhile, Jacob Schiff, one of the most powerful bankers of that era, took a different path. Schiff, head of Kuhn, Loeb & Co., refused to finance anything that would benefit the Russian Empire. To him, the Tsarist regime was an oppressor of Jews, and he used his financial influence to cripple its economy, refusing to provide any financial support to the government. In one of the most monumental financial and political moves in history, Schiff ultimately supported the revolutionaries who would bring down the Tsar. This was one of the clearest examples of the true power of bankers. A man sitting in New York without armies or elections was able to directly influence the fall of an empire that had existed for centuries. But this influence wasn't limited to wartime. The connection between bankers and politics ran far deeper than most people realized. At the turn of the 20th century, the American economy was booming, but also facing crises and instability. J.P. Morgan, realizing that the government was incapable of managing financial crises alone, took it upon himself to stabilize the economy. For many, without their intervention, the United States would never have become the global economic superpower it is today. But for others, the truth is that these men simply learned to play the game better than anyone else. They knew that wars and crises were opportunities for expansion, and that financing governments was a way to control their decisions. This event proves something fundamental. Bankers were no longer just financiers of the economy. They were its true decision makers. It was this crisis that led to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, a central bank heavily influenced by the top financiers of the time. This ensured that the financial system wouldn't be fully controlled by the government, but rather managed by a network of private banks that would continue to shape the country's monetary policies. This level of influence raises an inevitable question: were these bankers saviors of the economy or manipulators of the system? One thing is certain: politicians change, leaders come and go, but money remains, and whoever controls the money controls everything. This was the peak of Wall Street bankers' power, an era where money spoke louder than any law. There was a time when kings and emperors dictated the course of humanity, but by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the true rulers no longer wore crowns or commanded armies. They didn't appear in newspapers as presidents or prime ministers, yet their decisions shaped entire economies, destroyed empires, and created new global powers. If before bankers had been working behind the scenes of politics and the economy, now they had become the true architects of the global financial system. Governments depended on their loans, entire industries grew under their financing. They not only controlled the flow of money, but also dictated what could or could not be built, which companies would thrive, and which would be eliminated from the market. This was the period when modern investment banks were born, institutions that didn't just store money or lend to small businesses, but orchestrated massive mergers, manipulated markets, and determined the fate of entire sectors of the economy. And two names emerged as synonyms for this new financial empire: Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers. Goldman Sachs began as a small financial consulting firm, but quickly realized that real money wasn't just in providing services. The real power was in dominating the financial market. In just a few years, the bank started creating and selling securities, driving corporate mergers, and essentially becoming the engine that powered Wall Street. One of its biggest innovations was the idea of taking companies public, something common today but revolutionary at the time. This allowed major corporations to raise money without relying solely on banks, creating a new cycle of economic expansion. But at the same time, it ensured that Goldman Sachs gained increasing control over the companies it financed. Meanwhile, Lehman Brothers followed a different but equally ambitious path. The bank started as a small cotton trading business in the southern United States, but the Lehman Brothers quickly realized that the real opportunity wasn't in selling goods, it was in financing the trade itself. Gradually, they moved away from agriculture and into the financial game, first funding businesses, then governments, and eventually becoming one of the largest investment banks in history. This rise was fueled by a crucial factor: the industrial boom and rapid urbanization in the United States. Between 1870 and 1920, cities expanded at an unprecedented rate, factories sprang up across the country, and railroads stretched across entire regions. None of this growth would have been possible without the bankers who financed it all. Who built the railroad tracks? Who funded the steel mills that produced the materials for skyscrapers? Who provided the capital for the massive expansion of industry? The same men who had understood the money game from the very beginning. But what truly solidified the power of these bankers was their relationship with governments. When economic crises emerged, who did politicians turn to? Bankers were no longer just the financiers of the economy. They were the system itself. When wars needed financing, who had the capital to fund them? The pinnacle of this financial dominance came in the early 20th century, when governments realized they could no longer function without Wall Street's backing. What had once been a group of successful bankers had transformed into an untouchable financial elite, a small circle of men who had the power to determine the fate of the global economy. This was the era when Wall Street bankers ruled the world. They decided which countries would receive investments, which industries would have access to credit, and which markets would be shut down. No president or prime minister could ignore this reality. If a government dared to challenge them, they cut off financial flows, strangling the country's economy. They didn't need armies, they controlled the world's financial heart. And the absolute dominance of the financial elite was about to face its greatest test yet. But no empire, no matter how powerful, lasts forever. Success comes at a price, and the greater the power, the stronger the resistance it faces. For decades, the bankers who dominated Wall Street built financial empires, financed wars, influenced governments, and turned money into an instrument of global control. But every rise has its fall, and over the years, the money kings faced crises that threatened to bring down everything they had built. From the beginning, these bankers were viewed with suspicion. They had arrived in the United States as Jewish immigrants, fleeing persecution in Europe, and within a few generations, they had surpassed industrial magnates and become the true masters of money. To many, this was a testament to genius and strategic vision. To others, it was something dangerous and suspicious. It didn't take long for conspiracy theories to emerge. In conservative circles of the time, the idea spread that Wall Street had been taken over by Jewish bankers conspiring to control the world. The myth of Jewish control over money was a narrative that gained traction in the late 19th century and intensified in the following decades. Newspapers, politicians, and intellectuals began to fuel this idea, pointing to names like the Rothschilds in Europe and the Schiffs and Warburgs in the United States as supposed hidden architects behind economic crises and global manipulation. This rhetoric wasn't just empty talk, it had real consequences, inspiring waves of prejudice and even anti-Semitic policies aimed at limiting the influence of these bankers. However, the greatest test for this financial elite didn't come from conspiracy theories or political attacks. It came from the very system they helped create. But despite the hatred and persecution, these men continued to thrive. They had already learned that power doesn't come from popularity, it comes from controlling fundamental systems. So while politicians and populist leaders attacked them publicly, these bankers kept financing governments and sustaining economies and ensuring their financial dominance remained intact. The collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008 was one of the most dramatic moments in modern Wall Street history. The bank, which had started as a simple cotton trading business in the 19th century, had grown into one of the largest financial empires in the world, only to implode spectacularly, triggering the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. The 2008 crisis wasn't just about Lehman Brothers, it was a reflection of what happens when the financial system becomes too big to control. For years, investment banks had aggressively expanded the housing market, issuing increasingly risky loans and inflating a speculative bubble of unprecedented proportions. Lehman Brothers, as one of the leaders in that market, was highly exposed to risk, and when the bubble burst, there was no one left to save it. While Lehman Brothers collapsed, institutions like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan not only survived but emerged even stronger. Why? Unlike other financial giants, Lehman Brothers didn't receive a government bailout. In a move that shocked the world, the US government decided to let it fail, allowing a 150-year-old institution to simply collapse. It was a massive blow to Wall Street's confidence, a moment that proved that even the most powerful financial empires were wet indestructible. But the 2008 crisis also revealed something else. Not all bankers met the same fate. They faced attempts at destruction not by resisting change but by anticipating it. They shaped the rules of the game, and when necessary, they changed those rules to their advantage. Because the bankers who truly understood the money game knew that, in times of crisis, the priority is not to prevent collapse, it's to ensure that you are one of the survivors. The money kings had always understood that capitalism is a game of cycles. What seems indestructible today can crumble tomorrow, and those who fail to adapt will disappear. The price of success has always been high. Crises, scandals, and persecution are part of the journey of an empire. But in the end, the true money kings are not just those who accumulate fortunes, they are the ones who manage to maintain their power, even when the world crumbles around them. When you access your online bank account, make an investment, or watch markets react to Federal Reserve decisions, you are interacting with a system designed by men who understood that real financial power isn't in the present, it's in controlling the future. These bankers were the architects of the modern banking system. Before them, banks were simple institutions focused on holding deposits and offering basic loans, but they transformed banks into machines of investment, speculation, and economic control. They created investment banking, derivatives, and global financial markets. All of these are part of the legacy that still rules the world today. Mergers and acquisitions in the market, these bankers created that model. Investment funds, derivatives markets, international credit operations, all of these structures were born inside the banks they built. And perhaps the most impressive fact, the financial dynasties that started back then still exist today. Their surnames may have disappeared from the headlines, but the institutions they built continue to dominate the world. JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Goldman Sachs, all of these institutions still follow the same rules set by those first Wall Street bankers. They still dictate the pace of the global economy, still influence governments, and still control the capital flows that make the world turn. The impact of these banking dynasties isn't just in the financial system, it's in the way entire economies operate. These bankers consolidated the idea that financial markets must be interconnected, that money should not be restricted by borders, and that crises are just opportunities for those who know how to play the game. And if you think governments today have absolute control over their economies, think again. What does this mean? Who really regulates the economy? Central banks. And who influences central banks? The private financial institutions that dominate the market. It means that even though time has passed, the bankers of that era still rule the game. It doesn't add if the names have changed or if companies have merged. The model they created is still the backbone of the global economic system. They didn't just build fortunes, they built a world where their rules would still apply, even centuries later. But anyone who thinks financial power has been destroyed is mistaken. It has merely changed hands. Since the era of Wall Street's great bankers, much has changed. Physical money has lost ground to digital transactions, traditional banks now compete with fintech companies, and financial decentralization promised by cryptocurrencies is challenging the traditional banking system. The money game never stops. What was once controlled by men who financed railroads, industries, and governments is now transforming before our eyes. But is the model created by past bankers truly under threat, or has it simply adapted to remain in control? But the same bankers who were once considered the owners of money quickly learned how to play this new game. The promise of cryptocurrencies seemed revolutionary, a system where people could store and transfer value without needing banks, governments, or intermediaries. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other digital currencies were created to free money from centralized control. Today, major banks are already investing in cryptocurrencies, creating their own digital currencies, and developing solutions to integrate blockchain into the traditional financial system. Companies like BlackRock, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs now have specialized divisions in this sector. In other words, what seemed like a threat has become just another opportunity for expansion for the same groups that have always controlled the economy. If Wall Street bankers were once in control, today it's the tech giants. Amazon, Apple, Google, and Tesla hold as much money as many governments and have already begun interfering directly in the global financial system. So the question remains, who are the new kings of money? With their own payment platforms, digital currencies, and networks of control, they can manipulate markets, censor transactions, and define how money will move in the future. And more than that, big tech no longer depends on traditional banks to do this. Companies like PayPal, Stripe, and Square already handle billions in transactions without needing traditional banking methods. Decentralization isn't eliminating financial control, it's just transferring that control to a new elite. But does this mean that traditional bankers have lost their dominance? Not so fast. The world's major central banks are already developing central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, which could replace physical money and give even more power to governments and financial institutions that control the economy. The future of money won't be a battle between banks and cryptocurrencies. It will be a fusion between traditional financial control and new technologies that allow money to be manipulated even more efficiently. The names may change, the methods may evolve, but the essence of the game remains the same. If banks once had to influence governments, now they can simply become the direct issuers of digital money circulating worldwide. Money always belongs to those who understand how it works. What was once dominated by Wall Street bankers is now being contested by tech billionaires and governments seeking even greater control over their economies. The game isn't over, it has simply entered a new phase. What separates a billionaire from an ordinary person? The way they understand money. Wall Street bankers didn't become rich by luck, nor because they worked harder than everyone else. They understood something that most people never realize. Money isn't just a tool, it's a system, and whoever controls that system controls everything. These men weren't chasing quick profits. They knew that real wealth isn't built overnight, but over decades, even centuries. While most people focused on salaries and next month's bills, they were designing systems that guaranteed a continuous flow of money for generations. They didn't just accumulate wealth, they created mechanisms that made money come to them effortlessly, regardless of what was happening in the world. But there was something even more valuable than money itself: information. What truly set these bankers apart wasn't just the fortune they amassed, but the access they had. They knew where to invest before anyone else. They understood the economy's cycles before the media even noticed them. They could predict crises, foresee market trends, and position themselves ahead of time. Information has always been the most powerful asset, and those who control it hold the greatest advantage in the financial game. They also understood something most people don't. Crises are not obstacles, they are opportunities. While the majority panicked during economic recessions, these men knew that those were the moments when real empires were built. They bought when everyone was selling, expanded when fear dominated the market, and took advantage of uncertainty to reinforce their control over industries, economies, and entire nations. Yet, true power isn't just about how much wealth you have, it's about who you influence. These bankers built networks, financed governments, and shaped economic policies. Money on its own means nothing if it isn't accompanied by influence. They made sure that those who rose to power needed their support to succeed, creating a system where they were always indispensable. If someone depended on them to grow, that person could never bring them down. And perhaps the greatest lesson they left behind was that the true game of money isn't about working harder, it's about building something that outlives you. They didn't just create wealth for themselves, they established institutions, financial networks, and markets that continued to grow long after they were gone. Their names may have faded from the headlines, but the systems they designed still govern the global economy today. The world has changed since their time, but the rules remain the same. Money always flows toward those who understand it. Those who can see beyond the short term, who control information and influence, who know how to turn crises into opportunities, and who build lasting systems. These are the ones who stay at the top. If this video changed the way you see the world, you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment below which of these lessons impacted you the most. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to understand how the world really works. This was another video here on Scheffer Vision. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.